Morning and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This morning, we are going to continue testimony on S325, and we welcome Ed Stanek.
Good morning, members of the committee, and thank you for this opportunity to speak with you about S325. By way of introduction, I'm a resident of Barre City, and I was a state employee for 32 years. Administering Act 250, I worked in all 9 districts from Newport to Bennington, Brattleboro to St. Albans, although the bulk of my career was spent in District 5, which consists of 35 towns in Washington County, Orange County, and Lamoille County. During the era I worked for Act 250, many of the towns in Lamoille County were so-called 1-acre towns, either having just zoning or nothing at all in terms of local control. So I had a lot of experience in towns which had no way of dealing with anything back in that era, including waste disposal, sewage systems. I like to tell my kids I worked for the state over the course of 2 centuries. I pre-filed my testimony with this committee, and I don't intend to read my testimony to you, just to give you the highlights and answer any questions that you might have. I tried to put all of my comments in the context of 325 rather than Act 181, which is a given. Its passage, so I'm trying to address only the provisions which are part of 325. One section of both acts, Act 181 and the bill 325, deals with roads. As I pointed out in my testimony, roads and jurisdiction go way back with Act 250 to the beginning of its passage. There was a rule known as the so-called road rule. At that time, it was Rule 2A6. And in reality, that rule was adopted by the Environmental Board to reduce jurisdiction, because in the initial 8 years of Act 250, any construction of a road associated with commercial purpose, which included the sale of lots, triggered Act 250. So in effect, the road rule was an attempt to tamper down the extent of jurisdiction to roads being over 800 feet in length or serving more than 5 parcels. Parcels at that time was a piece of land of any size. This was the era when lots were only below 10 acres. But parcels were lots, pieces of land of any size. Again, keeping it brief, I'm still ambivalent to this day with the road rule, which was repealed in 2001. 2001 was part of the legislation that dealt with changing the definition of lots to include a piece of land of any size. A bit of a horse trade, I think, took place. And the reason I'm ambivalent about the road rule was that there were cases where it was extremely useful. And a good example of the road rule being useful is a case called Kissel, which I didn't mention in my pre-file testimony. Kissel is K-I-S-I-E-L. Kissel was a project in Waitsfield, which had the maximum of local control, permanent zoning, permanent subdivision regulations. And nevertheless, there were aspects of development in high elevation settings that the town could not get its hands around. Act 250 review took place because of the road rule. So the Environmental Board decision in Kissel is a good example of things I think that the legislature is still trying to get at with respect to roads and even Tier 3. Footnote to history, Kissel was appealed to the Vermont Supreme Court and reversed, but only on criterion 10, having to do with town plan. But Kissel is still a valid decision under all the other criteria, such as headwaters, high elevation settings, habitat, et cetera. The other side of that coin is the downside of the road rule. It got to the point where designing around the road rule was resulting in really terrible designs. Anything to do to reduce that road to 799 feet in length. Once upon a time in the last century, I did a dog and pony show before this committee of an example of how the bad designs were occurring. And again, keeping it brief, it involved a 1,000-acre parcel of land in the town of Cambridge, owned by 2 physicians in the state of Connecticut, 1,000 acres of land. On one side of Route 108 is the Smuggler's Notch Ski Resort. Subject to Act 250 review, many land use permits, a significant bear habitat on that parcel in a travel corridor. Of course, the bears don't respect property lines, so the bear habitat extended to the other side, this 1,000-acre piece of land. So again, keeping the story short, what happened there was a classic example of 799-foot road, dividing that 1,000 acres up into 4 humongous parcels, right? Avoiding Act 250 jurisdiction. Same impacts on bear habitat, but no review. And at that point, and to this day, Cambridge has really not much of any local control, no Act 250 jurisdiction. So on one side of 108, the state is doing great work protecting a bear habitat functions. On the other side of the highway, couldn't do anything about it. Running the movie ahead, subsequent purchases of those initial 4 lots broke those up into more lots, 799-foot road, 4 lots. You can see where this is going. A footnote to history, before I came to testify to you, I Google mapped that parcel to see what happened in the real world, and so far nothing's happened on that parcel. However, and here's the big however, we often get into this discussion when I work for the state of vested rights. So all those site plans dating back now 25, 30 years are still filed away with the state and with the town. The question's going to come up whether somebody can claim vested rights, right, to go ahead with all of those lots which avoided Act 250 jurisdiction. So probably too much at length, but the road rule has come and gone. Roads were also addressed under Act 250 over many years under the category of infrastructure. Now, infrastructure, in my mind, goes back to the original statement of findings by the legislature in 1969. And those are found in the footnote to 10 VSA 6001, the history section, and if you look in the VSEA version of the law. And the legislature spoke about concerns about uncoordinated, uncontrolled changes to the land and to the environment being detrimental to the needs and desires of the people of Vermont. So again, keeping it brief, as Act 250 began to be administered, particularly what we used to consider the big league of Chittenden County, this is the 1970s, roads, sewer systems, water lines, all these yellow flags went up about infrastructure, So as those large parcels around what's now called Tap Corners began to be developed, the stubby little sewer line to the municipal system onto a 100-acre piece of land, I'm only building a widget store right now. Well, what else is that sewer going to affect? So there was a decision by the Honorable called Levinsky, a declaratory ruling, and that sort of framed the concerns about infrastructure, again, which is road, brings me back to road. Now, having said all that as background, I think one of the shortcomings of Act 181 is the lack of public education. And I've been beating on this drum even when I was a bureaucrat, and I was proud to be a bureaucrat. Since the era of the Romans, bureaucrats make government work. I always wanted to do a bumper sticker, proud to be a bureaucrat. But the problem with Act 250 has always been no PR, no positive PR. 56 years, that's the reality. And I think that even is more true now with the passage of Act 181. And we can see this playing out with the section about roads in Act 181. I wanted to correct to a certain extent in my pre-file testimony. I said part of the problem was misinformation and disinformation. That's sort of like a negative approach. I also think it's more of the lack of public education. I'm sure some of you may be following on Facebook and other sources the Act 181 comments, and there was a great comment by a fellow named Lou White. I meant to bring copies, I didn't, but Lou White, I think is from Heartland. Incredibly astute analysis about what if this with the roads, was this going to trigger jurisdiction for this and that? I think a lot of that could have been tampered down, or still could be tampered down if there was, taking a show on the road, public education. What is the purpose of roads? What could be the downside of roads? Tier 3, again, as I understand the current bill S325, it extends the implementation dates of Tier 3. As I suggested in my pre-hearing, my pre-file testimony, I was concerned that the Tier 3 provision was a bit doomed from the get-go for 2 reasons. One is it was premised upon rulemaking by the Land Use Review Board, and secondly, it was premised upon mapping. So my comments on that, rulemaking is an art, and I was lucky to be the benefit of knowing many people on the environmental board, some of whom were the original legislators for Act 250, such as Art Gibbs, John Ewing, Len Wilson. And rulemaking was really an art. They would set it up as a collaborative effort going out. And the point here, it takes experience, a sincere effort for collaborative input from the public and what have you. So therefore, to create a new land use review board, appoint those folks and tell them to go out and do rules now, I thought was, boy, this is going to be a misfire, right? How in the world could these people set up a new land use review board, take the show on the road without having had an opportunity to get some traction? So that was one concern I had from the beginning. premature rulemaking responsibilities by the Land Use Review Board. But the other concern is mapping. I'm sure some of you were aware that problems with mapping in Act 250 go back to the inception of Act 250. And by that, I mean the mapping that was done in the early 1970s and the effort to adapt the Land Use and Capability Plan. When I first started working for the state, there were copies of these maps of the entire state, very colorful, what have you. And my understanding was that they were really going to be used for jurisdictional purposes. Well, again, they got off on the wrong foot. Everything erupted around the state. That was the end of those maps. And that was the end of the effort to adopt the Land Use Capability Plan. So we had that experience with mapping and Act 250. So now we're in the era of mapping, as I understand it, under Tier 3, being relied upon for jurisdictional purposes. When I worked for the state, people would call up and say, I want to do such and such with my land. Do I need a permit? And we would give them answers like this. 99% of the cases, the answer was over a telephone. We would document it with in those days, one of these forms of carbon paper, triplicate, project review sheet. It was done, very quickly. I worry now about the use of mapping. And again, I'm an old dog, with the use of computers. But I kind of wonder if I was still working for the state, would I be able to give people an efficient response? Do I need a permit when they call up on the phone? When it seems to me heavily reliant upon mapping to determine whether or not you're going to need to get a permit. So with that as introductions, I go on to discuss a concern that the Supreme Court of Vermont articulated about Act 250. And this was back in 1982. Ironically, it involved the building, which is right over here now, where I always call it the Legislative Council, Economic.
JFO building?
That's right. It used to be called the Pink Lady.
Yep.
And the agency of administration was all about, back then, they were going to tear it down. I don't think they were going to do a parking lot, but they were going to tear it down for something. So that's what the agency of administration case was about, is that building. But the Supreme Court warned that Act 250 really cannot be turned into an administrative nightmare. That's the language in the Supreme Court decision. It should not be an administrative nightmare. That gets me into discussion of Vermonters with regarding protection of natural resources. Tier 3 is intended to cover critical natural resources. And I have a lot of faith that the majority of Vermonters do want to protect these resources. That's why people live here. That's why people want to protect and hand that on to the folks that come after them. As I expressed in my pre-file testimony, I was remembering the lyrics of an old song, you don't know what you got until you lose it. I think it might be interesting. I talked about the basic law of supply and demand, that the land with these natural resources on them will actually increase in value as time goes on. There's only so much of it, right? People will be looking for this down the road. The concern right now is that there's a downside economic impact. If I have to get an Act 250 permit, it's somehow going to devalue my land. It's going to cost me money. I think it would be interesting if there was a legislatively commissioned study to determine, would there be a positive impact on the economic value of land as a result of increased environmental regulation? I worked with Tom Cavett, you might know that name, as an economist in 1999-2000, when District 5 was reviewing the $300 million expansion of Stone Mountain Resort. And the District Commission at that time had concerns about the overly rosy economic impact analysis done by the bean counters for AIG, which owned the company. So the District Commission retained Tom Cavett to do an analysis. Smart guy. And it'd be interesting if Tom or someone like that took a look down the road. Could there be a positive economic impact on these lands protected, having these important resources, such that the people that own it now, who really want to pass it on to their kids, there's a benefit, there's a win-win from having the increased regulation. So back to the administrative nightmare. The Environmental Board, dating back to a decision called Blodgett Supply Company, which was a declaratory ruling on jurisdiction, Blodgett, B-L-O-D-G-E-T-T, talks about the bright line on jurisdiction. Again, this goes back to being able to give people a quick black and white answer if they needed to get an Act 250 permit. So in that context, the bright lines for jurisdiction, I wanted to be so bold as to make some suggestions to try and accomplish the same goals of Tier 3, but not the complications of the mapping and all that analysis. So I have two suggestions to change existing law. And again, this is about what we're trying to get at with the critical natural resources. My feeling is a lot of those resources are located above the 1,500-foot elevation. Bright line, 1,500-foot elevation. So I would suggest that 10 VSA 6003A, which is the definition of the word development, that be amended to say that that section of development applies to all tracts of land above the 1,500-foot contour, and development for commercial or industrial purposes above that elevation will be treated as if all towns are 1-acre towns. Now, let me explain. Right now, almost all those towns above 1,500 feet are 1-acre towns, right? Minimum of zoning or subdivision regulations. A lot of them, such as Stowe, Manchester, have lands above 1,500 feet. Those are the 10-acre towns. I did some poking around a couple of years ago to the content and quality of decisions in, I won't mention any towns, but 3 of the major, we'll call them ski towns, maximum of local control, to see exactly what they did with some of the important natural resources. I had a specific interest in habitat impacts and what have you. And I was discouraged because the decisions of the DRBs really didn't get into it. And I understand the reason for that, because going back in time, I can't tell you how many cases I dealt with in Warren, Waitsfield, Fayston, Stowe, where when it came to dealing with impacts on bear travel corridors or what have you, the DRBs would say, Act 250 will take care of that. The state has access to wildlife biologists. The state has access to a lot of that stuff. So when I took a look, and I didn't do a detailed analysis of some of the decisions over the last few years, I really don't think the towns are yet picking up the ball to deal with that stuff. So in a long-winded way, I suggest amending 10 VSA 6001-3A to say that above 1,500-foot elevation, commercial or industrial development in all the towns above that line are considered 1-acre towns, right? So what that means is a 10-acre town gets the same review as a 1-acre town. The focus is on those important critical natural resources. And the second amendment I would recommend is to 10 VSA 6001-19. That's the definition of subdivision. That's where we talk now in current law about the subdivision of land into 10 or more lots. I would suggest that it be amended, again, lands above 1,500 feet that are going to be divided into 3 or more lots within a 5-year period. Now, people would say, well, whoa, wait a minute. Well, I can't divide my land. You know, I can only do 3 lots in 5 years. Well, in my alleged retirement, I do a lot of work with folks in rural districts who are dealing with permit process. I do all this pro bono, and they're not anti-regulatory. They really do understand the importance of protecting the natural resources. And I rarely run into a Vermont resident that has done, you know, more than a couple of lots within 4 or 5 years. So, you know, by reducing jurisdiction on lands or increasing jurisdiction on lands above 1,500 feet to trigger jurisdiction for review 3 or more lots in 5 years, I don't think is going to really put a burden on most Vermonters. The big time developers, yes, they'll have to go through the permit process. I also wanted to mention, I should have mentioned in the beginning, I'm not tooting my horn here, but during the course of working for the state all those years, I probably processed hundreds of land use permits. The number of denials, I was thinking on the way over today, in all seriousness and all honesty, less than 20. Less than 20 denials in 32 years, hundreds of permits issued. And the point here is that Act 250 was and is a permitting process. That's how it was set up from the beginning. Yes, some projects get reshaped. Yes, there are mitigating permit conditions, but there's not denials. And the vast majority of the projects go forward. So back to my song and dance here, and I'll try and wrap this up. You know, how can we accomplish the goals of Tier 3 without administrative nightmares? How can we improve the bright line of jurisdiction? Those 2 suggestions about statutory changes. And I also suggest, back to rulemaking, that, you know, the Land Use Review Board, I think, could take on rulemaking with respect to breathing more life into the administration of the 10 criteria. Having read Act 181 and understanding the intent of what we want to consider critical natural resources, I couldn't come up with an idea of a critical natural resource that hasn't already been covered one way or another with Act 250. So I think that by revising the Act 250 rules, having the Land Use Review Board do that, looking at precedents of the Environmental Board, the Environmental Division of Superior Court, we can provide a lot more direction to putting traction, to putting teeth into the protection of critical natural resources under the existing criteria. And I think the Land Use Review Board could do that. And I think the maps could be used for that. I'm not down on maps completely. Maps were extremely useful, not for jurisdiction, but for the substantive review. So if a project needed Act 250, the maps were very helpful to determine, where does Smokey the Bear live, where are the deer yards and what have you. Those for the substantive review. And I can tell you in the 32 years of work for the state, I can't remember anybody really arguing over maps. They would talk about the quality of the impacts and what have you, but mapping seemed to work okay. So to wrap it up, I appreciate again the opportunity to share these insights with you for what they're worth. I'd be glad to provide citations to some of the Environmental Board decisions that I mentioned on Bright Lines on Jurisdiction, the Kissel decision. And likewise, I'd be glad to share with the committee, I have access to maps about lands above 1,500 feet, and also a breakdown, which is very interesting, about the ownership of the lands above 1,500 feet. How many of those lands are under private ownership and public ownership? And I'll leave it at that. Answer any questions you might have for me.
Thank you. Thank you for being very aware of the time. We have a number of witnesses and we want everyone to have the same amount of time, and you did really well. So everyone gets probably about 20 minutes to speak, and then we'll have a few questions. Do members have questions? Representative North and then Austin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick understanding of your proposal on dividing land into 3 or more lots across 5 years. So if somebody has 100 acres and they identify 2 subplots, 2 little 10-acre plots that they want to divide off, does that then create 3 plots with now the 80 that are left plus the 2 little 10-acre plots? So now you have 3. So you're in jurisdiction then?
That's correct. Under existing precedents of the former Environmental Board, the retained land is considered a lot.
Okay, so really, what's that rule would piece, then you're really dividing it into 2, the remaining 90 plus the 10.
Right.
And so any more than dividing off 1 piece and you're triggering Act 250 jurisdiction.
Right. But here, I'll be honest with you. I've been in this building many times.
I'm sorry, I may be doing this.
Just to follow up on comment.
You'd have to stay muted too, Tim, even when you're presenting.
I'm suggesting 3 lots, and I'm sort of hoping for 5 lots.
5 lots in total, including the remaining left.
Correct. So it would be 4 lots, plus the 5th lot would be the retained land.
Which would mean you'd be allowed to divide off up to 3 at most.
4 lots within 5 years. So I'm suggesting 3, right?
Yeah.
I'm hoping that once compromises are done, it's 5.
Yeah. But even at 5, you can divide off at most 3, because then you're left with 4 in total.
Over 5 years.
Yeah, over 5 years. As soon as you divide off 4 separate ones, then you're left with 5 total, and you trigger the jurisdiction.
Right. Well, that gets me.
You got to
That's correct.
the number to identify the number of lots you can divide off.
Correct.
Representative Austin, did you have a question?
Yeah, I found it very interesting, that over 32 years, looking at hundreds of permits, 30 denials. My assumption with Act 250 is it's not a death knell, if you have to go through that review. And my assumption is people want to work with you, to allow you to use your property. But if there's, like you said, a deer yard or 100-year-old trees, the conversation would be, is there any other option for you to build? I think it's working with a landowner, to find
Right.
okay, that's what I'm assuming. And I'm just wondering, the denials, can you just talk a little bit about when things were denied, what triggered a denial?
Some were denied under criterion 8A for habitat. A couple of I thought very interesting decisions were under criterion 9L, the mystery criteria, rural growth area. One thing I wanted to hasten to add too is under 10 VSA 6087C, you can come back for reconsideration of a denial within 6 months. And some of those 20 denials came back. So in other words, the decision was a roadmap to the developer. Here's an opportunity to how you can correct or change the design and come back. So not every denial was project dead on arrival. Some of those denials got the permit on the rebound. So it is a collaborative process, and it is a permitting process.
I find I have a lot of questions, but we need to stick to
I
the
understand.
time, so we may invite you to come back.
I'd be
Thank
glad
you
to
very
come back.
much for
Okay.
testimony.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next up is Tim Taylor.
See, I doubt I'll be as efficient. Farming for all these years, I got pretty efficient. Well, nice to be back. Kat, can you get me up there or how do I need to do this?
So you'll hit share on,
Yeah. Share where?
Stay muted.
yeah, so you're gonna stay muted.
Yeah, right there.
So you're actually already in here. What's happening is your iPad is. Share.
No. Well, it says only you can do that.
Yep, so I'm gonna accept you over
Okay,
here.
thank you. What could I tell you in the interim?
Well, you got such a great name, Tim Taylor.
I know, I've had to deal with that for a long time.
Do you mind if I,
No, get her going any way you can. You know, I'm 74, gonna push 75. I'm doing pretty well just having this thing.
do you know where the
Yeah,
document
the
is?
screen, yeah, it's just floating around. So you hit, I know, I learned this yesterday from John. You hit broadcast, counts down. And then we swipe that. And then we can, you're sharing
Yeah,
it
so
right now.
this is the part you'll have to,
There we go.
there we go. So that should be up there.
Okay, here we go. So,
I'm just gonna turn this back down.
okay, yeah,
Yeah,
give her.
there you
that. I'm Tim Taylor. Happy to be back. I haven't been back in a few years, which I don't know is such a good thing. I mean, I think it's a good thing I have been in some ways. But if you look at the screen there and you see the old comment that Act 250 is a little scary. Well, I can tell you climbing in that balloon at 10 in the morning with my neighbor on his second beer could be a little scarier. Or facing you all might even be scarier still. So anyhow, so the farm was born in 1980. And it's kind of checking you all out a little bit too. That's my daughter there. We spent 42 years farming. The little guy there is just had his 14th birthday. So this is a few years ago. Just so you know me a little bit, my wife and I were 2006 Orange County Farm Bureau Farmer of the Year. I'm a past president of the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association, which I was on for a long time. And I even taught a semester of sustainable agriculture at UVM. The 56-acre farm grew from a card table into where we grow about 30,000 pounds of tomatoes. And we've over the years sold, several $1 million worth of stuff to the Upper Valley, principally restaurants, summer camps. We have a stand now down next to King Arthur. So that's the farm in a nutshell right there. Right next to Lake Fairley, if you know where that is. A lot of you folks bring your kids down to Camp Billings over the years, some of you. And so you get to know us. I was chair of the District 3 Environmental Commission from 2021 to 2022. I would have loved to stay on. I had been appointed by Governor Shumlin, reappointed twice, reappointed by Governor Scott twice until he fired me in August of 2022. I think I was very good at my job, to tell you the truth. Issued over 200 permits in that time period, denied perhaps 10 in that time period, of which including exit 1 at Queechee, and exit 4 we never did deny because that got taken care of in a different way. Also on the Thetford DRB back in the 80s, and then came back on in 2003, and I'm presently chair there. Thetford representative to T-Rock, and before I farmed, I was a 1978 graduate of BLS, the first class to know that you were going to get certified. And when I started my clerkship, I had the privilege of coming to Norwich and sitting at a very big table, about half this table, next to a man named Norris Hoyt.
My dad.
Your dad.
Yep.
And I sat right at the end of his table for about 6 months until he could find a room for Peter DeMurals and myself. And Jonathan Brownell was his partner, and he was one of the authors back 250. So your dad was Harvard.
Yeah.
And Jonathan was Yale, and they were a lot smarter than me. But I learned a lot. And I could tell you so many stories. I remember your mom bringing you in. And by the way, Jamie Hosley says hello.
20 minutes, Tim.
Yeah, sorry. Well, I probably put 20 hours into this thing, so give me a break here. So I started this off with I ended up putting this in. So this was from Dean Davis in Act 250 in an interview in environmental report. And I just wanted to read one thing. I'm actually amazed at what we did get. Really, this whole thing, Act 250, runs counter to Vermont's tradition with reference to the use of land. I mean, Vermonters feel land is sacred, and we don't want anybody messing around with our land, much less the government. And it goes on, and you can read it later if you like. The point was that something had to happen. And I think now, once again, we're at this critical point. It's a point where, once again, he comments about economic depression as maybe challenging it. So what I'm here to focus on, since I am a farmer, I am really going to focus on these exemptions that just passed on the floor of the Senate, which I think pose dire consequences to agricultural land, and I think are so important to be considered. And also, they're the interim exemptions, and they're also part of the 1B exemptions. And two things were done on the floor. One of them was to take away the restriction on 10 acres or less. So these 50 houses that could be built in these during this interim period in these village centers, they had to be on 10 acres or less. Now they don't, if it gets to the house and becomes built, right? What that means is the concept of compact villages is right out the door, right? We can sprawl all over this, what I will show you in a minute. The second thing is that all the 1 acre towns now qualify for this 50 exemption, and there is no local zoning, there's no Act 250 review. There's essentially nothing, which they have right now. They can put in 5 units before they trigger Act 250, okay? So I'll move along. So here, I happen to take Craftsbury, not because I don't love Craftsbury, I do, Judy here, I love those folks up there, but I happen to see these 3 little designated villages. And they're a population of about 1,352, which sort of fits into our 1 acre town populations. And do you realize that 46% of our towns are 1 acre towns and they don't have zoning or subdivision? They might have one, they don't have the other, okay? And this is true of this fine place. And the one on the right is East Craftsbury. So that's a map of East Craftsbury. And I just chose to focus on it for a moment. They have a community center, but you see around this little village, all this agricultural soil, right? So now that shows you the designated boundary that you can find on A&R. And from that, we pop out a 1/4 mile with the exemption, interim or 1B. And look what we're starting to take into account there. Look what we're hitting. Well, when I pop that over, you'll really see it. It's prime agricultural soils, all of it. Some of the most important production soils in the state. Okay. I know we need houses, but we need to eat too. So if the amendment becomes law, then there will be I'm going to just review this. There'll be no clustering, no site planning. I think 50 units is too big anyway. When this first came in, as chair of the DRB in Thetford, we have 5 villages where this can happen. We could have 250 units being built right now. I think I'm pretty good at what I do on the DRB, and we have a pretty good zoning, pretty rigorous. But the concept that we would be able to actually do site planning without that kind of review that Act 250 does, we have pretty comprehensive, but it's not enough. So anyhow, let's bounce back. Here we go. See, I'm moving along pretty good now. Post Mills, where I live, there's a Lake Fairley over to the right, has 128 people. It's the home of Crossroad Farm and the Vermontosaurus, which, by the way, is under Act 250. That was a very interesting hearing just before I came on the board. A lot of hue and cry about that one. That was an interesting hearing. So what you see here is that red circle shows you how part of that Crossroad Farm, this is 18 acres of agalon soil, which is perhaps the most productive in the state, arguably. In the drought last year that everyone worried about, right? That we have irrigation that goes out there. It had to be irrigated so little. It has, when you pick it up and you mush it in your fingers, you can feel all these clay particles. So that would be captured by this. And were it not for the fact that this is a conserved farm now through VLT, and I think I might have you partly to thank for that. I think you might have been on the Housing and Conservation Board at the time. I might have met too, I'm not sure. Statewide soils, people don't think are quite as useful. This is based on production of corn, silage, and hay. I can tell you that statewide soils that drain even more, that are a little more gravelly, fantastic for vegetable farmers because we can get on them early, we can irrigate them, and we can bring crops to the market much, much sooner, usually 2 to 3 weeks earlier than we might be able when we get on the agalon. It's a little wet spring. So here we are back, and I wanted to show you this because I just wanted to show you how Act 250 has actually worked in the past. And, you know, when all these changes came about, when the commission report came out 5, 6 years ago, I said to myself, why? I mean, this thing has worked pretty well. It's supposed to go after large developments. It's not supposed to really go after the little guy particularly. It's worked pretty well just as it was. So in the late 1980s, there was a proposal on this circled piece here for 56 units on 79 acres in the Post Mills Village. Well, we have a little over 100 houses. Okay. Schools were filling up, by the way. We were about to have to build a middle school. People forget that. You know, the younger folks forget how close we were to full population in our schools. Okay. So that came in and there was an Act 250 hearing, and this is what happened. Okay. It was the balancing act, I like to call it, of long-term sustainability. So what you see is that in green, you had 23 units that were, it was first of all allowed to be divided into 16 lots. 23 units were put off into the woods and then down along Route 244 past the church. And that was going to have actually 4 duplexes on it. We won't get too detailed. The next part was the agricultural field, that field that's in white. And you see the little round red circle there. That was where the wastewater system for these 23 units would be pumped to. And that is all existing today. It's still functioning. I walk on it every day. Over to the left is what is now called the Taylor Floodplain Preserve. It's a piece of land that when we acquired it, we offered it to the town of Thetford. They took it. And it's interestingly, one of the few wooded floodplains in the state of Vermont. Most floodplains, as you know, either got, because they're long rivers, got commercially developed or got farmed. Okay. That was a 37-acre piece. So I guess my point to you here is, look, this was way back then, and look how it worked. We got housing, maybe not as much as the developer wanted. We got farmland that allowed a certain farm to grow, as it turned out. The parcel just north of to it, where the green is, that once was going to have 10 2-acre lots in 1982. George Huntington was going to build them. That got denied by them under 9B, which is the 9B has to do with soils and farming. He hadn't shown that he couldn't build on the other side of the road. So he actually turned around and sold it to us. Became the cornerstone of the farm. So here we go. My suggestions with this amendment is remove the entire amendment. Just take it right out. Reduce reduce the number of housing units from 50 to 10 in the 1 acre. If you want, I know there's a hue and a cry going on right now. Throw them, you know, let them do on a larger scale what they can do. They can do 5 units now before they trigger Act 250. But in the 10-acre towns, I would suggest reducing that to 25 units or less. I we have, as I said, we have 5 of these designated villages in Thetford, right? I went before our select board and said, please don't give 1B. Don't ask for that. 50 units is too much for us. 20 or 25 might be one thing not to have the Act 250 review. But this 50 is nuts. We're good at what we do, but not that good. Restore the 10-acre or less requirement for siting the units in all designated village centers. I think that's really important. Come on, if we're looking for sustainability, we need to keep some of those agricultural soils. I've been worried since day one that because our village centers are generally along rivers, that's where our glacial till soils were built up over the years, right? Okay. And then reduce this interim exemption. I mean, 2028 is enough, another 2 years. If you guys get elected again, who knows what's going to happen, right? 2028, you can do it in the next biennium. So I'm going to jump for a moment to the road. How am I doing? Am I doing it?
You need to kind of wind down.
Okay, road rule, law, and guidance. So there's the law, and this is the definition, and this is 2 road rule examples. And I've gotten these passed by the powers that be that I'm accurate on this. So you have an entryway. I like that. Don't call it a road, don't call it a driveway. Into 1 to 3 lots, which could have 2 duplexes. That's 6 units now, plus 3 ADUs, which don't count. So a duplex counts as 1 unit, right? You're allowed 3 in this exemption. Okay, total 9 units could be there. It does not trigger Act 250 as long as the total access is not over 2,000 feet. Not too bad. Not a bad carve out. Whether it's legal or not remains to be seen. It's in the guidance. It's not rule at this point. It doesn't really reflect the statute that accurately. I would suggest you might want to put it in there and make it more accurate. So entryway to 4 or more lots or units, the entryway is now a road and must be 800 feet or less. And the total of the road and driveway must be less than 2,000 feet not to trigger jurisdiction. Okay, so now we're going into 4. So now that entryway is a road, has to stay 800 feet or less, not to trigger Act 250. Okay. I like my Bobcat picture a lot. So tier 3, I had a lot of talk with some folks from Pomfret. Many of you might know them. And they are generational owners of farm and woodland there. And they have conserved their soils and their land for years and years. And just like me, they don't really like too many people. Well, we're very public, never mind me. But there are experts who've studied this for years and years. And it's not to stop someone from going into these tier 3 areas. It's to help them give a little guidance to these tier 3 areas. Okay? Not only that, very particularly, jurisdiction is going to be limited to the involved land. You know what that means? It's not, if you've got 500 acres and you have this one little tier 3 spot, right? Headwaters, if it is, access to that. It's only going to be that involved land. It's not going to carry over just like it doesn't in farming. Its jurisdiction is only on the involved land. It won't be on the whole parcel. So if you do something else, you won't have to go through Act 250 or deal with them. Incidentally, we're under Act 250. My place. And also the criteria looks like it's going to get limited impact right from the start. So we would do that in Act 250 anyway. We would only address the criteria that were under consideration and might have some conflict about, but this will be very specifically aimed at that. Summary. Here we go. Nice picture for that. 42 years, still a steward. I'm a steward of the land, right? And I've enjoyed my friendship of learning from experts such as Vern Grubinger, who's been here before, I think, our vegetable extension specialist. I've recognized the need to be educated and regulated by the Agency of Agriculture, as is soil health, for example. Sometimes, every 5 years you need to do a soil test. Well, that's important. You need to check on your organic matter, you need to check on your pH, that kind of thing. And I'm grateful that I could make noise in the evening to irrigate my crops because of the exemption for farming, which hopefully will be straightened out this time, or spread manure and make a little smell. So I appreciate all that kind of freedom too. I want you to understand that. And guess just finally, after all, we're all together in this complex society, trying to work together a little bit. And I think that's where we're at. And I just wanted to mention, I think to you, you're Corinth, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I was the captain of my rifle team at Scarsdale High School in the late sixties. I saw you were a lifelong member of the
You
NRA.
know what? Now that you bring that up, I welcome that coming back to schools. Thank you very much for
I
bringing
just
that.
wanted you to know that. We're all a mix of things, I guess. So that's my testimony.
Thank you for your testimony.
I
And
hope that made some sense to you all.
yeah, that was great. I noticed your summary slide didn't make it in your submission to
Oh, it didn't make, yeah, that's because it came from, yeah.
resubmit.
Yeah, I'll send that to you individually. I'll take a screenshot. Yeah, I did it this morning and in between visiting the bathroom a couple of times.
And we do have time for some questions. So do folks have questions?
No questions.
Actually, I mean,
Really hard.
Go ahead.
I have a question. It's one of the ones I was gonna ask the previous witness. You know, one of the challenges as Vermont develops and grows is the incremental change piece of this. And Act 250 does a pretty good job of capturing larger developments. But our smaller developments are adding up.
Yep.
And I don't know what thoughts have you, I'm sure you've thought about that, and I'd be curious if you could share them and if you're not prepared to now.
Well, sure, I've thought about it. You can't help but wonder about it as you drive around and see things you have permitted and things you haven't. And of course, in 1 acre towns, very often we'd go into a town and say, hey, I don't need to be here if you would just get subdivision and zoning, because this is commercial development is, on 1 acre, but if it was a 10-acre town, I wouldn't be here and you all be dealing with it. But then you'd see all this other development. And I guess I have to reflect on, I've been up here since law schools in the 70s and 69. I agree. I know what you're saying, but I'm not sure that this incremental development isn't just part of the way life is at this point. I know that's not a very good answer. I just think that I believe in the mom and pop subdivision. I believe in the mom and pop development. And so I want jurisdiction. I want to make sure we preserve agricultural soils. And but I'm just not sure how far to go with that. And that's your job to figure it out.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and it's a tough job. Don't get me wrong. When we had a choice of when our Bedford Planning Commission ZBA in the 2000s could split, I went with the quasi judicial DRB, not the planning, because it's really hard what you have to do. As you know, and balance it all out. Maybe a little more jurisdiction on a few of the things, but mom and pop's important. It really is.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, thank you. You're aware of how much housing we need
Yep.
in order to keep Vermont affordable. The legislature is looking at three things, I think: healthcare, education, and housing. So we have to have housing. We have to have people to move up here to replace our workforce, not for taxpayers that much, but our workforce is aging out. So my assumption, without any kind of background knowledge, is that there is enough ag land, there's enough open space, and there's enough room for the quotas of housing that we need. Because if we can't build that housing, Vermont's going to be really hurting. Vermonters are going to be really hurting in terms of economic development and, funding. So is that assumption correct to think that way?
This is one of the most difficult balancing acts I think we face right now. Perhaps if this 56 units had been built in this agricultural field, Bedford wouldn't have had a problem. But I can tell you also the taxpayers would have been paying for a middle school. So that's the flip side of the coin at times. When we all came up here, we kind of didn't stay in the village centers, us baby boomers that came from the burbs. We kind of went off into the woods. We bought little lots that were kind of affordable still. And we kind of worked with the local folks. That was my impression. So like a poor farm road in Bedford, if anyone knows where that is now, is it dead ends, but all these houses, it's a perfect example of rural scattered growth. I actually not a big believer in this may sound terrible, these smart growth principles that you're going to jam everyone in the village centers. I don't think people who live here, that many of them want to be here. I think they like the rural areas. But I do feel that, so for instance, that's why I showed you what happened at Crossroad Farm, right? You know, at this parcel, you have woods that you can put these units in and still have agricultural fields. But right now with these exemptions, they can go anywhere and there's no control. No one's going to say anything about it. You know, before we issue a permit in Thetford to someone who owns a lot, if they plop it right in the middle of an agricultural field, that's a violation. We don't have to issue that permit. We can shove it off to the side and have them move it a little bit so that that field can still be hayed and whatnot. But they get their permit. Remember, this is all about not denial. This is about conditioning, either whether you're on a DRB or on an Act 250 commission. We're working with people. I want to say one last thing about that too, because Act 250 has gotten criticized for years and years. And one of the things that I found with our coordinators was they work so carefully with folks who did not have the means to hire the consultants and do the big thing. And that's the same thing we do in Thetford. And you can figure out who they are very quickly. And I'm not sure I like the online application because that isn't that hands-on that goes on with the coordinators. And just like everything's done by email, I used to sell all my crops by the phone and by knocking on doors, right? But yeah, to answer your question, obviously we got to have some more housing, but I don't think we're the problem so much, Act 250 or regulation. I think it has to do with everything else. When we raised our kids in the 80s, we didn't have them become, we wanted them to sit at these stupid things rather than get out and become carpenters and plumbers. All my friends who came up and were high school and college educated, so many of them, they skipped law. I mean, they did law or whatever. They became contractors, plumbers, now they're all retiring. So we need to push that. I don't have all the answers.
No, thank you. We have a lot of background
Yeah.
information.
Yeah, no.
Thank you again for your testimony.